All right, strap in everyone because today we are taking a deep dive into USAID. You mentioned wanting to get a better handle on what's going on, and let me tell you, there is a lot to unpack here. We've got news reports, expert opinions, even some firsthand accounts about what's happening on the ground. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. It's a complicated situation for sure, and it's evolving rapidly.
So maybe before we get into the weeds, let's start with the basics. What exactly is USAID? What do they actually do?
Well, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, it's been around for a while. Actually, it was started way back in 1961 by President Kennedy. It was his idea of how America could really make a difference in the world.
Okay, so like sending aid after a hurricane or an earthquake.
Yeah, that's part of it. Disaster relief is definitely a big part of their mission, but it goes way beyond that. Over the years, USAID has become a major player in global health, like fighting HIV/AIDS, tackling malaria and tuberculosis. They even played a leading role in the response to the Ebola crisis.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility.
It is, and they're also involved in promoting democracy and economic growth around the world.
I imagine all that takes a big chunk out of the federal budget.
You'd think so, right? But surprisingly, it's actually less than 1%.
Really?
Yeah, less than 1% of the entire federal budget.
That's amazing.
It is. And that small percentage has a huge impact. I mean, we're talking about preventing pandemics, stabilizing regions that are at risk of conflict, and ultimately making the world a safer place for everyone.
Okay, so USAID is doing all this incredible work on a shoestring budget, it sounds like. But why is it suddenly causing so much controversy?
Well, things have gotten pretty heated recently. The Trump administration, well, they've got Elon Musk advising them on government efficiency, and they're taking some pretty drastic steps when it comes to USA.
Okay, fill me in.
Well, for starters, Musk has called USAID a criminal organization. He says it needs to be shut down completely.
Whoa, that's some pretty strong language.
Yeah, it definitely is. And the administration seems to be taking his advice to heart.
What do you mean?
There are reports that they're actually shutting down USAID headquarters.
Shutting it down.
Yeah, and they've put a lot of staff on leave, plus they've frozen a lot of aid programs.
Wait, the in Greer headquarters? That sounds pretty chaotic. What's the reasoning behind all of this?
Well, there are a few different factors at play here. Trump has said publicly that he thinks USAID is wasteful and inefficient. He's even called the people who work there radical left lunatics.
Okay, so there's definitely an ideological element to this. But what about Musk? What's his motivation here?
Well, he basically agrees with Trump about the waste. But he's also really critical of what he sees as USAID funding, like woke causes. And there are some Republicans who agree with him. They say USAID doesn't fit in with Trump's America First agenda.
So we've got accusations of waste, ideological clashes, maybe even corruption. This is a lot to process.
It is, and we haven't even touched on the potential legal and political ramifications of all this.
Right, because you can't just shut down an organization that was created by Congress, right?
That's the big question. I mean, to dismantle USAID entirely, Congress would have to get involved, and so far that hasn't happened.
Sounds like we might be headed into some murky legal territory. Okay, so we've established what USAID is and why it's in the spotlight. But what does all of this actually mean for the people on the ground? What are the real-world consequences of these actions?
Well, that's what we need to look at next. We've got to understand the human cost of all of this.
Absolutely.
Because this isn't just about politics, it's about real people's lives.
Exactly. And I think we have some stories that really illustrate that.
Let's hear them, because I think those stories are what really bring this issue home.
Okay, so we've heard some pretty alarming things about the situation with USAID, but before we get too deep into the potential consequences, I think it's important to understand what's really at stake. What difference does USAID's work actually make? Like, what's the tangible impact on the ground?
You're absolutely right. We need to go beyond the political rhetoric and look at the human impact.
Exactly, and I think some of the stories we have really bring this issue home.
Well, let's hear them, because I think hearing these stories is what really drives the point home.
So one story that really struck me, it was about this clinic in Kenya. They had to let go of nurses because of the USAID funding freeze. And now they're struggling to provide HIV medication to patients who desperately need it.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the ripple effects. One policy decision made thousands of miles away can have such a devastating impact on the ground.
It really makes you think about how interconnected the world is. Like, decisions made in Washington, D.C. can have real consequences for people in Kenya, in Afghanistan, Syria, everywhere.
Absolutely. And we're seeing similar stories emerge from all over the world. There are reports of safe houses for women fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan. They've been forced to shut down because of the funding cuts. And even prison guards in Syria, the ones responsible for guarding ISIS fighters, they've walked off the job because they haven't been paid.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and the consequences are just catastrophic.
It's a very real concern. The potential for increased suffering, instability, even outbreaks of diseases in countries that rely on USAID. It's a real possibility.
Okay, so let's say the U.S. does scale back its involvement in foreign aid. Is anyone else ready to step in to fill that gap?
That's a crucial question. And a really complex one. Some of the sources we've looked at, they point to China and Russia as potential candidates. They've already been expanding their influence in regions where the U.S. has been a major aid provider.
That makes sense. If there's a vacuum, someone's going to fill it. But how does their approach to aid compare to the U.S.?
That's where things get interesting. The U.S. has traditionally focused on what they call soft power, using aid to promote democracy, human rights, good governance. The idea is to use aid not just for immediate relief, but also to foster long-term stability and development in a way that aligns with American values.
Okay, so it's like using aid as a tool to influence global affairs, but not necessarily through military force.
Exactly. It's about building relationships, fostering goodwill, promoting a particular vision for the world.
But China and Russia, they probably have different motives.
They tend to focus more on securing their own economic and strategic interests. Things like access to resources, infrastructure development, strengthening their own geopolitical positions. They're not as focused on promoting democratic values or human rights.
So this could lead to a shift in global power dynamics.
Absolutely. And it raises some big questions about what a world with less U.S. involvement in foreign aid would actually look like.
Okay, let's go back to the U.S. for a second. We talked about the ideological clash between the Trump administration and USAID. Can you explain a little bit more about what they mean when they criticize USAID for being woke?
Well, it's a loaded term, for sure, and it means different things to different people. But from what I've gathered, their concerns seem to revolve around a few key areas. One of them is USAID's support for family planning and reproductive health programs.
Can you be more specific? Like, what exactly are they objecting to?
Well, USAID has been funding organizations that provide access to contraception and safe abortion services in countries where it's legal.
And that's a stance that certain groups within the Republican Party strongly disagree with.
Right. They see it as promoting an agenda that clashes with their values. And it's not just about abortion. There's also pushback against USAID's support for LGBTQ plus rights and their work on climate change.
Okay, so there's a real clash of values here. And it's playing out on the global stage. But where do we go from here? What are the long-term consequences of all of this? Well, we've covered a lot of ground, from the history of USAID to the current controversy. But the big question is, what happens next? What does the future hold for USAID, for global development, and for the countries that depend on this aid?
It's a critical moment, no doubt. The situation with USAID has really exposed some vulnerabilities in the whole global aid system. It's forcing us to think about the role of the U.S. in the world and the future of development assistance in general.
You mentioned vulnerabilities. What did you mean by that?
Well, for one thing, it's highlighted how fragile these aid networks can be. We're seeing how quickly decades of work can be disrupted by political shifts, and rebuilding those networks, regaining that trust, reestablishing that expertise. It takes time, and it takes resources.
So even if funding is restored later on, the damage might already be done.
That's a real possibility. And the impact goes beyond the U.S. This situation could make other donor countries hesitant to step up if they see aid becoming politicized, subject to certain changes in priorities. They might be less willing to commit resources.
So it's about eroding trust in the whole system of global development.
Exactly. It creates uncertainty and makes it really hard to plan long-term projects.
And what about the countries that depend on this aid? What are their options if the U.S. pulls back?
Well, some might turn to other donors like China or Russia. But as we talked about, those relationships come with their own conditions.
Right, and what about the countries that can't or won't go that route?
That's where things get really concerning. Without adequate support, they risk falling deeper into poverty and instability. It becomes a vicious cycle.
It's a grim picture. But are there any potential upsides here? Could anything good come out of this?
Some people argue that this could push recipient countries to become more self-reliant, force them to find their own solutions, diversify their economies, invest in their own people.
So a shift from dependency to empowerment.
That's the idea, but it's not easy. It requires strong leadership, good governance, a commitment to human capital development. And those are things that are often lacking in countries struggling with poverty.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. The choices made now will have a huge impact.
Absolutely. It brings us to a final thought. If USAID's approach to foreign aid is changing, what might the future of global development look like? And given the potential ripple effects, what responsibilities do other nations have in addressing global humanitarian needs?
Those are important questions, and there are no easy answers. But by engaging with these questions, staying informed, and participating in the conversation, we can each contribute to a more just and equitable world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to get involved. Until next time, stay curious.